The bridal train smelled of fear, cheap lavender water, and unwashed bodies. When Beatrice stepped off into the blinding Dakota dust, the murmurs started. She was heavy, taking up too much space in a harsh world. Salvation didn't come from a handsome cowboy. It came from a dirty, 4-year-old girl pointing a sticky finger. The wooden planks of the Bitter Creek station platform radiated heat like a cast-iron stove. Beatrice Caldwell stood at the end of the line, her hands folded tightly over her stomach, trying to make herself small. It was a physical impossibility. She was a broad woman, thick-waisted and heavy-hipped, poured into a brown wool travel dress that felt like a straitjacket in the July sun. Sweat gathered at the nape of her neck, trickling down her spine beneath her corset. Around her stood 11 other women. They were nervous, hollow-cheeked things mostly, factory girls from Chicago and Boston who had traded the suffocating lint of the textile mills for the barren promise of the West. They smelled of stale bread and desperation. Beatrice smelled of lye soap and the peppermint drops she'd been chewing to kill the nausea of the 3-day train ride. 50 feet away, the men waited. Beatrice bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted the sharp, metallic tang of copper. She knew how this worked. It wasn't a courtship. It was a livestock auction. The men ranchers, miners, shopkeepers shifted on their boots, spitting brown streams of tobacco juice into the dust, their eyes raking over the row of women. She heard the voices. They didn't bother to whisper. Out here, manners were a luxury that had dried up with the last rain. "Look at the swayback on that one," a man in a battered bowler hat muttered, pointing a calloused finger toward Beatrice. "Horsed break its spine, hauling her up a ridge. Ain't got enough flour in the territory to keep her fed, neither." Another chimed in, eliciting a low chorus of chuckles. Beatrice didn't blink. She didn't flush. She just stared at the weathered grain of the depot wall behind them. She was 28. Back east, she had been the spinster sister, the unpaid maid who ate the scraps after her brother-in-law and his 5 children finished dinner. When the food ran short, the resentment grew. "You take up too much room, B." That was the unspoken truth. "So," she answered the advertisement, "a man in Dakota needed a wife. Any wife." The matron of their group, a severe woman named Mrs. Gable, began matching the couples based on the letters they carried. One by one, the thin, pretty girls were claimed. The men took their carpet bags, offered stiff arms, and led them away to the magistrate. Soon, only Beatrice and a girl named Sarah, who had a violent, wet cough, remained. The man Beatrice was supposed to marry, a Mr. Thomas Miller, stepped forward. He was a wiry, nervous man, with a receding chin and eyes that darted everywhere, except at her face. He looked at the paper in his hand, looked at Beatrice's imposing figure, and visibly paled. Miller stammered, taking a step backward. "There's been a mistake. I asked for a stout woman to work. Yes, but not this. I can't." He crumpled the paper, dropped it in the dust, and practically ran toward the saloon. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the platform. The remaining men lingered, watching the spectacle. Someone laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the hot air. Beatrice's knuckles turned white around the handle of her carpet bag. "Don't cry," she ordered herself. "Do not let them see you bleed." Then the crowd parted. He didn't walk so much as he displaced the air around him. The man was massive, broad-shouldered and towering, wearing a buckskin coat that looked heavy enough to stop a bullet. He smelled fiercely of pine, pitch, raw earth, and wood smoke. His beard was thick and dark, streaked with premature gray, and his eyes were the flat, pale gray of a winter sky. He carried a Winchester rifle in one hand, like it weighed no more than a walking stick. But it wasn't the man that caught Beatrice's attention. It was the child clinging to his left leg. She was tiny, maybe 4 years old, wearing a faded flour sack dress that was 3 sizes too big. Her blonde hair was a rat's nest of tangles, and her face was smudged with dirt and what looked like dried blackberry juice. She peered out from behind the giant's leg, her blue eyes wide and entirely unfiltered. "Hayes," Mrs. Gable breathed, her severe face contorting into something like fear. "You have no business here. These women are spoken for. Or were. Gideon Hayes didn't look at the matron. He looked at the women. His gaze swept over the coughing Sarah, dismissing her instantly. A woman coughing out here was a woman who would be buried before the first snow. Then his pale eyes locked onto Beatrice. He didn't sneer. He didn't evaluate her waistline. He looked at her broad shoulders, her thick wrists, the solid, unmoving way she stood her ground. The little girl let go of his leg and took 3 steps forward. She stopped right in front of Beatrice, craning her neck to look up. Beatrice looked down. The child smelled like unwashed hair and wild mint. "Papa," the girl said. Her voice was loud in the quiet morning, rough like she didn't use it often. She raised a small, dirt-caked finger and pointed directly at Beatrice's stomach. "Marry the fat one, Papa." A collective gasp went up from the remaining onlookers. Mrs. Gable looked like she might faint. Beatrice felt a hot, humiliating flush finally creep up her neck. Even the children, she thought bitterly. Even the filthy, feral children see nothing else. But the girl wasn't finished. She took another step, pressing her small, grubby hand against the heavy wool of Beatrice's skirt. "She looks soft," the child stated matter-of-factly. "Like the feather tick. The others are too bony. They'll hurt when I hug them." Beatrice's breath hitched. The word soft hung in the air. Nobody had ever called her soft. They called her sturdy. They called her a burden. They called her fat. But soft? Soft was a luxury. Soft was comfort. Gideon Hayes stepped up behind his daughter. He rested a massive, calloused hand on the child's tangled head. He looked at Beatrice, his expression entirely unreadable. "Her name is Clara," he said. His voice was a deep rumble, vibrating in his chest. "I'm Gideon. I run a trapline up the Black Ridge. It's a 3-day ride. It's isolated. The winters are 50 below, and the work doesn't stop." He didn't ask her name. He didn't apologize for his daughter's bluntness. "I need a mother for her," Gideon continued, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "I need someone who won't blow away in the first wind, and who won't break when the work gets hard." "You scared of hard work?" "I'm scared of starving," Beatrice said. Her voice was surprisingly steady, low and lacking any feminine flutter. "I'm not afraid of work." Gideon nodded once. "Grab your bag." The wedding took 4 minutes and cost $2, paid in silver coins that Gideon slapped onto the magistrate's mildew-scented desk. Beatrice signed her name in the ledger without trembling, though her hand felt entirely disconnected from her body. An hour later, they were grinding their way out of Bitter Creek in a springless wooden wagon. The transition from the sweltering plains to the rugged foothills was brutal. The wagon jostled over iron-hard ruts, slamming Beatrice against the wooden bench. Every jolt sent shockwaves up her spine, but she clamped her jaw shut. Gideon drove the draft horses in absolute silence. Between them sat Clara. The child was a restless ball of energy, firing off questions until the wagon's rhythm finally lulled her. Beatrice felt a sudden warm weight against her right thigh. She looked down. Clara had slumped over, her cheek pressed heavily into the folds of Beatrice's wool skirt, fast asleep. Beatrice froze. She held her breath, terrified of waking the girl. The physical sensation of a child leaning on her for comfort was alien. Back east, her nieces and nephews avoided her. To them, Aunt Bee was the furniture, the one who scrubbed the pots. Slowly, hesitantly, her thick, lye-reddened fingers reached out. She let her hand rest lightly on Clara's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. Gideon noticed. Without turning his head, his grip loosened slightly on the reins. "She ain't had a mother since she was born," Gideon murmured, his voice barely carrying over the rattling wheels. "Fever took my wife 3 days after Clara came." Beatrice processed the math. 4 years. A newborn in the wilderness alone. Who watched her when you checked your traps? Strapped her to my chest. When she got too big, I left her with the hounds. But she's feral, needs a woman's hand. He paused, his gray eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't expect romance, Mrs. Hayes. I expect a partnership. You keep her fed, keep the cabin from rotting. I'll keep you provided for." Mrs. Hayes. The name landed heavily in her ears. "A partnership," Beatrice echoed. "I understand. It was a profound relief, truly. The cynical part of her, the part that had survived 28 years of subtle cruelties, was glad. A business arrangement was safe. You couldn't break your heart over a business arrangement. They camped that night under a canopy of stars that looked terrifyingly vast. The air turned brutally cold the moment the sun dipped behind the jagged teeth of the Black Ridge. Gideon built a fire with mechanical efficiency, handing Beatrice a tin plate of beans and salt pork. She ate in silence, the grease coating her tongue. Ravenous as she was, she stopped halfway through her portion, setting the plate aside. Gideon frowned, the firelight casting harsh shadows across his scarred face. Eat it all. You'll need the fat for the altitude. Beatrice stiffened. The word fat stung, even though applied to the pork. I've had enough, thank you. Suit yourself, he grunted, tossing his empty plate into the scrub box. They slept in the wagon bed under buffalo robes. Gideon gave Beatrice and Clara the thickest pelt, taking a worn blanket near the tailgate with his rifle across his chest. Beatrice lay awake listening to the wind howl through the pines, inhaling the raw, wild scent of the buffalo hide. Clara was curled against her side, a small furnace of heat. Beatrice wrapped her arm around the child, a fierce protectiveness flaring in her chest. By late afternoon of the third day, the horses pulled them into a clearing near the top of the ridge. Beatrice stared. The cabin was a rough-hewn structure of massive pine logs sealed with mud chinking. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to withstand a siege. A stream cut through the property over black rocks, and a crude smokehouse stood off to the side. "We're here," Gideon announced, setting the brake. Stepping down, Beatrice's legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the wagon wheel to steady herself, her breath coming short in the thin mountain air. Gideon pushed the heavy oak door open. "Ain't much," he warned. He was right. The inside of the cabin smelled of stale smoke, wet dog, and old grease. The floor was packed dirt. A massive stone fireplace, a heavy table, a rusted cast-iron stove, and 2 beds occupied the space. Animal traps and pelts hung from the rafters, casting grotesque shadows. It was utterly devoid of a woman's touch, a place of survival, not living. Clara darted inside, diving under the large bed to retrieve a carved wooden bear. "Look!" she yelled. Beatrice walked in slowly. She ran a finger over the table. It came away thick with gray dust. She looked at the rusted stove, then at Gideon. He was watching her from the doorway, his massive frame blocking the fading sunlight. He was waiting for her to cry. He was waiting for her to complain, to realize she had made a terrible mistake. Instead, Beatrice set her carpet bag on the dirt floor. She rolled up the sleeves of her heavy wool dress, exposing her thick, pale forearms. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice flat. "Yeah? Where do you keep the lye, soap, and scrub brushes?" Gideon's eyebrows twitched. "In the shed, out back." "Fetch them," Beatrice said, turning her back to him to inspect the stove. "And boil some water. We have a lot of work to do." For a long moment, Gideon didn't move. Beatrice could feel his gaze heavy on her spine before she heard the soft thud of his boots turning away. "Yes, ma'am," he murmured. That evening, the cabin echoed with the violent sound of scrubbing. Beatrice didn't stop until her hands were raw and her back screamed in agony. She scrubbed the table, the chairs, and the floorboards near the hearth. She tore the filthy blankets off the beds and threw them outside to air. When she finally collapsed into a chair, wiping sweat from her forehead with a dirty forearm, Gideon walked in carrying a bucket of fresh water. He looked at the gleaming table, then at Beatrice. Her hair hung in damp, mousy strands around her flushed, heavy face. She looked exhausted, unkempt, and entirely unbeautiful. Gideon set the bucket down. He walked to the shelf, pulled down a battered tin box, and set it on the clean table in front of her. Beatrice looked at it suspiciously. "What is that?" "Tea," Gideon said. "Black. Cost me 50 cents in town." He didn't say anything else. He turned and went back outside to unharness the horses. Beatrice sat alone in the quiet cabin, her stinging hands resting on the cool wood. She stared at the tin box. It wasn't a bouquet of wildflowers. It wasn't a poem. It was practical. It was fuel for a tired worker. But as she touched the cool metal, the tight, bitter knot she had carried since stepping off the train loosened just a fraction. "Mama?" Beatrice jumped. Clara stood by the fireplace, rubbing her eyes with a dirty fist. The word hung in the air, echoing off the newly scrubbed walls. "Mama." Beatrice swallowed hard, her throat impossibly dry. She looked at the feral little girl, then down at her own heavy, calloused hands. She wasn't soft. She wasn't beautiful. But in this cabin, at the edge of the world, maybe she didn't need to be. "Come here, Clara," Beatrice said gently, her voice cracking. "Let me wash your face before bed." October arrived not with a turn of leaves, but with a violent plunge in temperature. The wind off the Black Ridge ripped through the pines, sounding like a screaming woman. Inside the cabin, the reality of survival took precedence over everything else. Beatrice learned the brutal economy of a mountain winter. She spent her days rendering deer fat into tallow, her hands constantly slick and smelling of raw meat and ash. She chopped wood until blisters formed, popped, and hardened into yellow calluses. Her heavy frame, the very thing that had made her a pariah in Boston, became her greatest asset. When she threw her weight against the churn, the butter came faster. When she hoisted a cast-iron Dutch oven full of stew, her thick arms didn't tremble. Gideon was gone for days at a time on the trap lines. When he returned, he brought the scent of copper blood, wet fur, and freezing ozone. He would drop the pelts by the shed, strip off his frozen buckskins by the fire, and eat whatever Beatrice set in front of him with a terrifying, silent hunger. They shared the large rope bed, but an invisible wall of ice lay between them. Beatrice stayed rigid on her edge, wrapped tightly in her wool nightgown, terrified that her heavy thigh or broad hip might brush against him and provoke disgust. Gideon slept on his back, stiff as a corpse, exhaustion claiming him the moment he closed his eyes. The closest thing they had to intimacy was Clara. The child was the tether holding them in the same orbit. Under Beatrice's relentless scrubbing, the dirt and blackberry stains vanished, revealing a pale, sharp-featured little girl. Beatrice taught her to mend socks, to knead bread, and to read from a battered family Bible she had brought from the East. When Gideon was home, he would sit by the hearth, whittling or mending traps, just watching the two of them. His gray eyes would track Beatrice as she moved around the cabin, unreadable and heavy. Then came the second week of November. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the snow began to fall. It didn't drift. It drove down in thick, blinding sheets. Gideon had been gone for 2 days. He was supposed to be back by noon. By dusk, the wind was shaking the mud, chinking from the logs. Beatrice paced the dirt floor, her heavy boots making soft thuds. She fed the stove until the cast iron glowed a dull, angry cherry red. Clara sat on the rug, unusually quiet, clutching her wooden bear. "Mama?" Clara whispered. "Is Papa lost?" "Your Papa knows this mountain better than the wolves," Beatrice said firmly, though her stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. She didn't feel soft. She felt brittle. He arrived past midnight. The heavy oak door smashed open, letting in a swirl of violently white snow. Gideon fell over the threshold. He didn't stumble. He collapsed like a felled tree, his massive frame hitting the dirt floor with a sickening thud. Beatrice was there in a second, shoving the door shut against the howling wind before dropping to her knees. Gideon. He was covered in ice. His beard was frozen solid to his collar. When Beatrice rolled him onto his back, she smelled the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. A crude, blood-soaked rag was tied tightly around his upper thigh. "Trap," he gasped. His lips were a terrifying shade of blue. His eyes fluttered, rolling back. Snapped. Caught the meat. "Clara, get the blankets!" "Now," Beatrice barked. Panic threatened to choke her, but she swallowed it down like bile. She grabbed her sewing shears and went to work on his frozen canvas trousers, cutting the rigid fabric away. The gash was ugly, deep, and ragged, the edges white from the cold and the center steadily pulsing dark blood. She washed it with boiling water and lye soap. Gideon groaned, his massive hands blindly grabbing at the dirt floor as the burning water hit the raw flesh. Beatrice didn't stop. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow she had dried in September, binding it tight with clean linen strips. But the bleeding wasn't the immediate threat. The cold was. His skin was like marble. The fire was roaring, but Gideon was shivering so violently his teeth clicked together. Hypothermia. Beatrice had seen it take a stable boy back in Massachusetts. Once the shivering stopped, the heart stopped. "More wood, Clara," Beatrice ordered, stripping off Gideon's soaked coat and icy shirt. She piled every blanket, every buffalo robe they owned over him. It wasn't enough. The cold was inside his bones. Gideon's shivering began to slow, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. Beatrice looked at the fire. She looked at the man dying on her floor. Then she looked at her own hands. She stood up, her fingers clumsy with haste. She unbuttoned her heavy wool dress, letting it fall to the floor. She stripped off her petticoats, her corset, down to her thin cotton chemise. The cold air of the cabin bit into her bare arms and heavy thighs. For 28 years, she had hated this body. She had bound it, hidden it, starved it, and cursed it. It was too much. It was grotesque. But right now, it was a furnace. Beatrice lifted the heavy buffalo robes and slid underneath, pressing her bare skin directly against Gideon's freezing body. He gasped, a weak, ragged sound. Beatrice wrapped her thick arms around his chest, pulling his icy torso against her large, heavy breasts. She threw her thick leg over his good one, enveloping him completely. She buried her face in his frozen neck, forcing her body heat into him. "Don't you dare die," she whispered fiercely into his ear, her voice rough with unshed tears. "You promised me a partnership. You don't get to quit the work." For hours, they lay there on the hard dirt floor. Slowly, agonizingly, the terrifying chill radiating from his skin began to recede. The violent shivering stopped, replaced by a deep, shuddering warmth. Gideon's breathing leveled out. Sometime near dawn, as the wind outside finally died down to a low moan, Beatrice felt him shift. She tried to pull away, suddenly hyper-aware of her near nakedness, of the heavy rolls of her stomach pressed against his hard, lean flank. The shame she had fought off in the panic came rushing back, suffocating and hot. But a massive, calloused hand clamped down on her thick waist. Gideon's gray eyes opened. They were bloodshot and exhausted, but sharp. He looked down at where they were tangled together. He felt the softness of her hip, the broad expanse of her back. He didn't pull away. "Stay," he rasped, his voice vibrating against her collarbone. His thumb moved, just once, stroking the curve of her heavy waist. "Don't go cold on me now, B." Beatrice froze. He had never called her B. She closed her eyes, burying her face against his chest, and for the first time in her life, she let herself be held. The infection never set in, but the torn muscle in Gideon's leg grounded him for 6 weeks. For a man accustomed to the brutal expanse of the wilderness, being confined to the cabin was a cage. He sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, whittling wooden toys for Clara and watching Beatrice. He watched her constantly. Before the blizzard, his gaze had felt like an appraisal, a rancher checking his livestock. Now, it felt entirely different. It felt heavy. It made the hairs on the back of Beatrice's neck stand up. She would be kneading dough at the table, her forearms dusted with flour, the physical effort making her breasts heave beneath her cotton dress. She would look up, and Gideon's pale gray eyes would be locked onto her. When she caught him, he didn't look away. He just held her gaze until her cheeks burned and she forced herself to look back down at the dough. The silence between them changed. It was no longer empty. It was thick, vibrating with unspoken things. "You're putting too much back into that," Gideon said one afternoon. Beatrice paused, a heavy wooden bucket of water in each hand. "Excuse me?" Gideon pointed a whittling knife at her. "The water. You're lifting with your lower back. You're strong, B, but you'll snap your spine carrying water from the creek like that. Bend your knees. Let your thighs take the weight." Beatrice flushed, acutely aware of the lower half of her body. "I have managed perfectly fine, Mr. Hayes." "Gideon," he corrected quietly. He set the knife down. "I ain't criticizing you. I'm just saying." He leaned back in the chair, his bad leg stretched out straight. "I've watched you work these past months. I never seen anyone, man or woman, work as hard as you do. You don't quit. I told you at the station, I'm not afraid of work. I know, he said softly, but you don't have to carry it all by yourself anymore. It was the closest thing to tenderness she had ever received. Beatrice set the buckets down, her hands shaking slightly. By late April, the snow began to bleed away, revealing the black mud and wet pine needles of the ridge. The ice on the creek fractured with loud, echoing cracks. Gideon was walking without a limp, though a deep, ugly scar remained on his thigh. One evening, after Clara had been tucked into the small cot and the cabin was steeped in the quiet crackle of the hearth, Beatrice stood by the table, folding dry laundry. The smell of lye and wind clung to the rough cotton shirts. Gideon walked up behind her. He didn't make a sound, but she felt the displacement of air, the sudden heat radiating from his massive chest. He reached out. His large, rough hands settled on her hips. Beatrice gasped, dropping the shirt she was holding. She stiffened instantly, her old instincts screaming, "You take up too much room. You are too big." "Gideon, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. She tried to step away, but his grip was firm, not painful, just immovable. "Please, what?" he asked, his voice a low rumble right next to her ear. "Don't mock me." Gideon slowly turned her around to face him. He looked down into her face. Her eyes were wide, defensive, and shining with unshed tears. He moved his hands up from her hips, spanning her thick waist, feeling the solid, heavy substance of her. "I have never mocked you, Beatrice," he said. The roughness in his voice was gone, replaced by a fierce, grounding certainty. "When I looked at you on that platform, I didn't see a burden. I saw a woman who could hold her ground when the wind blew." He raised one hand, his callous thumb gently wiping away a tear that had spilled over her lashes. "You saved my life," he continued, stepping closer so their bodies pressed together. "You gave my daughter a mother. You turned this rotting shack into a home." He dropped his forehead to rest against hers. Clara was right. "Right about what?" Beatrice choked out, her hands coming up to rest, tentatively, on his broad chest. "You're soft," Gideon murmured. He slid his arms entirely around her back, pulling her flush against him. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of flower and peppermint. "You're soft, and you're mine, if you'll have me." Beatrice closed her eyes. The tight, bitter knot she had carried in her chest for 28 years finally unraveled, dissolving into the warm, smoky air of the cabin. She wasn't a spinster. She wasn't a burden. She was Beatrice Hayes. She slid her thick arms around his neck, holding him just as fiercely as he held her. "I'll have you," she whispered. Outside, the last of the winter ice broke apart in the creek, the water running loud and clear down the mountain. If this Wild West story of survival, imperfect love, and finding your true worth struck a chord with you, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that real love doesn't care about perfection, and subscribe for more deep, emotional, and grounded storytelling. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment between Beatrice and Gideon? See you in the next one.